Greetings, humans. Welcome back to the Black Pill. The title of today's presentation is called Did Virginia Woolf Have Bipolar Syndrome? It's going to be a very air quotey kind of time we're about to have. Look, I discovered Philosophy Tube last year, and there's so much amazing content. Like, go over there and spend spend a year working through all the philosophy on Philosophy Tube. It's fantastic. I haven't even made it through everything yet. Thorne over there, as well as Natalie Wynn at ContraPoints and a couple of other great YouTubers, really inspired me to make my own channel. And I try to stick kind of within the fairly narrow bands in which I'm an expert, to the extent that is possible to do and still have any fun. So yesterday, I was watching a 5-year-old video on sadness and art, which I'll try to remember to link somewhere. And Thorne made this statement, kind of a throwaway statement. Virginia Woolf had bipolar syndrome. I don't remember if the exact wording was syndrome or disorder. It was a throwaway. It was a throwaway line, and like skipped over like really nonchalantly. And as an accredited diagnostician, as a clinical psychologist, this giant hole opened underneath me when that line was uttered. Certainly that line gets tossed around on the internet, lists of celebrities who have the thing that you have. And what does it mean? What does it mean to have a mental illness? What would it mean for Virginia Woolf to have a mental illness? Bipolar disorder was first codified with the publication of the DSM-4 in 1980. Virginia Woolf died in 1941, 42. Prior versions of the DSM referred to manic depression as a subset of generalized depression. Is manic depression the same thing as bipolar disorder? Well, previous versions of the diagnostic manual were not theoretically agnostic. That is, they supposed psychoanalytic causes for problems. The current version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is also not theoretically agnostic. It presupposes neurological reasons for disorders. Only the DSM-4 was overtly agnostic on those issues. What else? The list of symptoms was different. The definition of mania meant something else. Now we're onto the DSM-5 text revision. So much has changed. The previous iteration of bipolar disorder is recognizable in the current incarnation, but it's not identical. All right. The internet likes to claim mania was described in ancient Greece, but the word itself meant something different in ancient Greece, a kind of obsessive love. And it's hard to say that what they were describing in that time maps onto the clinical syndrome now. There's an even harder lift here that I forgot to script in because there's so much happening. This is going to be like an hour video probably. Is bipolar disorder a thing that occurs in nature, a phenomenon that we tripped over, discovered, and described? Or is it something that we invented? Are there things actually happening in nature that we collected under the heading of bipolar disorder? And bipolar is a heading and a tool and not a thing that exists in nature. That's a heavy lift. This must all seem quite boring wordplay. What it meant to be depressed or manic in Virginia Woolf's time might have little to do with what we'd identify as the disorder today. She died in 41, my notes say 41, before the widespread use of psychoactive compounds to regulate brain activity. Klonopin or Thorazine or something the first? Anyway, the way we express mood has also radically changed in the past few generations. People, especially white people in 1941, would be calmer, more deliberate, more inclined to speak with their words alone and not with gestures and not as much with inflection. Mood and emotion were not only less expressed, but less identified as such. What I mean is, yeah, and men. So the idea of the hysterical woman, this really would have affected what we'd think about Virginia Satir. The cishet white and male and middle class was normal, and the more steps you take away from that, the more abnormal that you are. And so women being seen as the weaker sex and hysterical and emotional and so on, because the norm was this male ideal of cold and rational, logical and inexpressive. Virginia Woolf might have been quite emotional compared to the men in her life evaluating her, and still actually be perfectly normal for a man or woman in modernity. So, like, hang on to that idea. Elders in America today, 80, 70 and up, I'd say, typically don't identify feelings of anxiety or sadness at all. They don't seem to consciously even have the experiences of anxiety or sadness. They instead identify backaches or upset stomachs. And the same is true for much of the rest of the world. In places with a profession of therapy and psychology, the expression of emotions and the direct experience of those emotions has risen. Older people remain quite stoic and have trouble relating to the dramatic feelings of other people. And in places without a tradition of psychology or psychotherapy, even younger people are going to identify bodily rather than emotional symptoms, right? They're not going to say, I have anxiety. They're going to say, my stomach really hurts. What was Woolf's individual experience? Beats me. Okay, that's still probably all quite boring. Here's where, at least for me, it gets really interesting and maybe controversial. Ethan Waters, I'm going to reference this book quite a lot. Ethan Waters, Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the American Psyche. It's 2010, that is. Waters investigates the origins of American psychiatric disorders in countries that are not the United States of America. In China, for example, there's a whole chapter. There were almost no presentations or cases in this language of anorexia until people started to see Western movies in the late 20th century. And the one or two cases that he could dig up just did not present the way that we describe anorexia in modernity. They were not about control or anxiety over appearance. They were about deep, demotivated depression where someone's literally too sad to eat. In Hong Kong, the more American standards of beauty were promulgated for women, and the more that happened, the more that women talked about their anorexia in the media, and the more that happened, the more women started to experience anorexia and describe it to clinicians in the way clinicians had described it to women. This is a tough one to wrap your head around. It isn't that women started to act as if they had anorexia. I hope you can hear all the air quotes. Rather, their experiences started to conform to the diagnostic category. Waters proposes this rough sequence of events, and I'm interpreting Waters. I'm not reading you from the book. But in the beginning, people suffer. And we suffer because that's in our nature, right? Life just is depressing and an anxiety producing, and there's not much evolutionary benefit for being happy. So we tend to be more unhappy than happy. It keeps us alert and realistic. We suffer. Suffering coheres around like cultural display rules. I'll get to those in a second. And so clinicians observe the suffering and detect patterns in it. Then they describe that pattern, name it, publish it, stand at podiums and talk to it in rooms of doctors and sometimes press, especially when life was more boring than it is now. You know what I mean? The population then start to become familiar with that description through presentations and papers in science journals, absolutely, but also through heavy and light propaganda. Come back and revisit again later. People begin to display their suffering then in the ways described by those clinicians and portrayed in culture. So everything from movies and magazine articles to people on the train, right? The display rules are contagious and enforced. Initially, maybe this seems like a stretch. You mean there was no depression before someone wrote the words in a manual? No, or at least not exactly, but the way we express our feelings is always shaped by culture. The display rules, for example, in America, women are allowed to be sad but not angry, and men are allowed to be angry but not sad. And we can demonstrate this in two ways. We can discover it and show the truth of the assertion. One, we can make some gender neutral avatars, right? And we know they're gender neutral when a third of people think they're male and a third of people think they're female and a third of people are like, I don't know, it looks gender neutral to me, right? Now you have a gender neutral avatar and you put an expression on the face. And when you put a sad expression on the face, suddenly more than half of people start to identify that face as female. And when you put an angry face on it, more than half of people start to identify the previously gender neutral face as male. You can do it the other way. You can take a bunch of photographs of people making an angry face, a bunch of people making a sad face, and then get actors to make a face halfway between angry and sad. I don't even know what that would look like, but you can do it. All right, smarter people than me have done that. And then you ask people, what is this expression? And on a female face, that expression is interpreted as sad, and on a male face, it's interpreted as angry. People making the same face are sad if they're women, mad if they're men. And that's why your mom isn't angry with you, just disappointed. Disappointment is a sad feeling. As a matter of fact, she's mad as hell, just not allowed to display it. Or at the extreme end, right? Not even allowed to feel it, that the feelings of anger get suppressed and reinterpreted as feelings of anger. Yeah, literally, because base level neuropsych, you're going to hear the limbic system is the seat of emotion. It's not. It's the seat of certain kinds of filter for experience. And the limbic system understands rage, disgust, and fear, and doesn't really know there's any difference between those three experiences. And it's the higher brain, it's the frontal lobe, a little bit right there, that really understands the differences between those things and can do the full range through interpretation, right? So the limbic system might feel a thing, and there might be a generalized state of apathy around sadness, and it's really only the frontal lobe understanding its experience through all kinds of lenses, including a cultural lens, that decides what ultimately the emotion is that's conscious and understood. So the way we express our distress, as well as all of our other internal experiences, is culturally regulated. And there are definitely psychiatric disorders that are extremely localized. In Japan, for example, young people sometimes have shut-in syndrome, hikikomori. They become more reclusive. They isolate in their bedrooms, sometimes for years, with their parents, trying to coax them out, but eventually surrendering, like bringing meals and leaving them on the floor outside the bedroom door like an offering at a tomb for a hungry ghost. And they come by in the morning and take the dishes away. And young adults, older teenagers will live in that room, have their whole lives on their internet, and never, maybe sneak out to pee at 3 a.m. or something, but never really leave that room. And that's a disorder that just isn't possible anywhere but there at a particular time in history. Another uniquely Japanese one is an extreme form of social anxiety in which one becomes obsessed with one's own body odor, particularly has a phobia of other people detecting that body odor, and go to extreme lengths not to offend by other people being able to detect your presence. Okay. To Americans, these things might sound quite strange, and I don't mean to exoticize Japanese society, especially with my super limited understanding from thousands of miles away. But consider anorexia. Consider how strange it would be in almost any other cultural context to have plenty of food and be obsessed with thinness, right? To the point of emaciation and death. For people outside the US, and to a lesser degree, Europe, experiencing anorexia like a young American woman would require a changing cultural context, not just disempowerment, but the expectation of power. For example, when I travel in China, it's quite difficult to eat with vegetarians. On one trip, a friend was vegetarian, and we figured it would be easier if we all ate vegetarian for the time we were with her, so that chefs aren't individually preparing dishes for individual people. And that turns out to be super hard to communicate. There isn't, at the time, there wasn't really a word for vegetarian. And the middle class was kind of a new thing, and eating out was kind of a new thing. and like the cook or the chef would spice even dress up even vegetable dishes with meat. So your asparagus has bacon in it because we can, and it's new and it's novel. And like understanding that in another culture, we've been spoiled for so long with so much food that we can choose not to eat certain kinds of thing is just a really difficult thing for other people to wrap their minds around. And gluten-free, trust me, is even more bizarre in other parts of the world. I don't mean to like judge anyone here or put anyone down here, but in other places it just is really difficult conceptually for people. So would Virginia Woolf have experienced her suffering differently if she'd lived in 2020, in a culture with a history of medicalizing emotions and destigmatizing psychiatric experiences? Would she have experienced it differently? Would she have been judged in a culture where it's just normal for us to have an expanded range of emotions? It's normal to be angry in public and demonstrate that anger. It's much more normal. Even tough guys cry now. Would her experience be different? Would the way she wrote about those experiences be different? Medicalizing? Bipolar is 25% heritable. That means if two identical twins are separated at birth and raised apart, there's a 1 in 4 chance that if one of the twins has bipolar disorder, the other twin has bipolar disorder. We'd estimate then that the genetic component is something like 25%, but even that's a dodgy, a risky, spurious statement, because it's not that those two people never shared any environment. They shared the uterine environment. And all kinds of stuff happens in utero, exposure to teratogens and hormone levels and noise and stuff that, see what I mean? You can't get a pure gene to environment ratio comparison. So we say it's about 25% heritable. We'll say it's specifically 25% heritable. But what that means is still open to some level of debate. When you see numbers higher than that, it's because there's this like propaganda war to get people to believe everything is biomedical. And so they'll do studies with twins or fraternal versus identical twins and conceal whether the twins were identical and whether the twins were separated or lived together, and draw all kinds of undue inferences to drive up that heritability number exactly to medicalize the disorder so that we can do medical treatments for that disorder. Even at that, even if we go there, that leaves 75% unaccounted for, right? If it's 25% heritable, then it's 75% environmental. Anecdotally, I've worked with 7 or so psychotherapy clients who came in with bipolar diagnoses, and every one of them had sexual abuse in childhood. That's anecdotal. It's not statistical. It just is, at least for me, food for thought on the topic. The literature doesn't have terribly much meaningful to say about that, so that's why I'm stuck with my anecdotes. Now, if it were genetic, would it be an illness? Would it be a mental illness? What does that mean? What does illness mean? And if it's caused by experiences, is that an illness? If depression, for example, were a mental illness, how would you catch it? How do you catch depression? From a dirty toilet seat at the bus station? Um, what I'm saying is thoughts can't be sick. Because they don't have cell structure, there's no infectious agent. These are abstractions. Thoughts are abstractions. Abstractions can't be sick. They can be abnormal, disturbing, deviant, but in this context, right, that's not what sick means. Those are equivocating arguments where you change the meaning of a word in the context of the argument. No, thoughts can't be sick because diagnosis is a medical procedure. We used to say bipolar illness. I still catch myself saying it in classrooms sometimes and I have to go back and correct. We still have a National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, who have doubled down on the neurogenic causes of mental illnesses, air quotes all over that stuff. But this fundamentally is about control. For NAMI, it's about destigmatizing. If you have a mental illness, it's not your fault and partially not your responsibility. And, there's something to be said. I don't want to crush NAMI here. There's something to be said for destigmatizing this stuff. But there's a downside, and we'll get to that also a little bit later. So construing problems of living, depression, anxiety, even bipolar to an extent, as illnesses, what that does is channel care for those problems into medical routes. It makes us seek the care in medical venues to begin with, And once we're in a medical setting getting advice for our problems of living, the treatments for those illnesses are psychopharmacological, almost entirely psychopharm. When the American Psychiatric Association put together the 5th edition of its diagnostic manual, every working group, every panel had at least one representative of psychopharmacology. We complained about this in 2012, 2013. We, like everyone except the American Psychiatric Association, and where are the social work representatives? Social workers use these manuals. Where are the psychotherapists and so forth? And they point to individual social workers or therapists or psychologists on the panels, but they were all invested in medical models, right? There was really nobody on these groups not invested in medical models, and there were people directly representing the interests of psychopharmacology. I shouldn't have scripted that because I can't say it. And the purpose of that is pretty obvious. The 5th edition is no longer theoretically agnostic. It advances a neuropsychological view of mental distress and disorder to sell more people more medication. Going back to Crazy Like Us, to me, the most important story is the medicalization of depression in Japan. Prior to about 1980, sadness was seen as a spiritual endeavor. Who can look at a flower and not recognize the impermanence of that flower? This is a moment in time, a beautiful moment, soon to end, never to come again. The first time you kiss a boy is the last time you kiss a boy for the first time. Your baby's first birthday party is their last first birthday party. Yeah? Every happy moment is necessarily shot through with sadness that's not unpleasant. It doesn't detract from the happiness of the moment. It's not a dysfunction. It makes each moment urgent, immediate, and poignant. Like the hot pepper in your burrito, that element of picante doesn't detract from the flavor. It adds to it. But a joint campaign of American psychiatry and for-profit psychopharmacology, changed Japanese people's perceptions of sadness from a valuable part of life to an unnecessary inconvenience. The program included, science articles in medical journals and, efficacy studies, and also news articles about people getting treatment, advertisements for medication, what I'm calling hard propaganda directly selling the idea that depression is a serious medical condition caused by a chemical imbalance. And celebrity cases of, famous stars bravely opening up about their depression or anxiety. What I'm calling soft propaganda. Because it's not done at the behest of drug companies. It's done with good intentions, destigmatizing. But it nevertheless causes people to think about their experiences in those terms, to buy into the identity of bipolar or depressed or ADHD, neurodiverse, autistic. I experience autism, right? So I'm talking from inside these experiences. The importance of this chapter to Americans is that Americans can see this being done to us for profit. Get the book, read the chapter, and you will see, in a stepwise process, how our sadness was medicalized. Anyway, Marxism. Cultural Marxism. No, back off, Jack. Look, I was in an elevator with the president of the BPS, the British Psychological Society. At that time, a very nice man who was overtly Marxist, right? That was his philosophy. It was on his webpage, whatever. So I'm going to give you some stuff here, and I'm not going to say it's Marxist ideology or ideas or whatever, because I don't read that stuff. I'm going to say we had this conversation, and this was the stuff that came up. It was in that context. Okay, let's go. To diagnose something as a psychological disorder, the problem must cause subjective distress or impairment. And when we're talking about impairment, we're trained, I am a trained diagnostician, we're trained that dysfunction is in one of three possible areas, the only three things humans can do: work, school, education, or your social experiences. Meaning, if your depression keeps you from doing your job, going to school, or having friends, and ultimately getting married to somebody in a heterosexual context, which is where homosexuality is a mental illness in DSM-2 and prior. Leave that all alone for now. Work. Do you own the means of production? Do you work for yourself? You probably do not. You probably work for a company, a small one, a mom and pop with a business license, or a big one. And you go to work earning very little money, maybe a subsistence living, maybe not quite a subsistence living, maybe a little more than that. But your work profits the people who own the company, the bosses, and some of the executives, and largely shareholders. So people earn, $10 an hour or so these days, probably, to go to work at Burger King for part-time hours with no benefits, not making a living wage, unable to pay their own rents. And the shareholders who own Burger King, are collectively earning tens of billions. Is that true? Um, Walmart and so on largely profits. The shareholders who own Walmart, and nobody working at Walmart really makes enough money to live. At McDonald's, your benefits plan is a sheet of paper in the break room telling you how to apply for Medicare and um, food stamps. That's your benefits package, like that. So if depression keeps you from working, depression is really keeping you from making profits for businesses in which you don't really have an interest. And if depression's keeping you from going to school, well, in modernity, why are you going to school? We've made education all about your employability, the skills you need to participate in the labor market that ultimately benefits shareholders and ultimately doesn't benefit you. It costs you money, an unending student loan debt to go to school. This is why we need student loan forgiveness, another topic for another time. And if it prevents you having a social life where you go out and spend money at bars and ultimately, in the heteronormative context, marry and buy real estate, if it's affecting your ability to do one of those three things, it's an illness. D.L. Hughley made this really underrated program 10 years ago now or something about how Black people are commodified in the United States. Is it called the endangered list? I'll try and remember to do a linky dilly. Okay, in the comments, the thing. Not the I don't know. We'll link it. In one part of the show, he's wandering around town. Which town? I forget. And he's just encountering Black men who have nothing else to do in the middle of a weekday and handing them stock certificates for for-profit prisons, right? He's giving them partial ownership of for-profit prisons because he's telling them that's where you're going to wind up. Man, that sounds so racist, especially coming from me. But there's a point. There's a point here, which is, he's saying if you aren't at work making money for those bosses and shareholders, then they'll have you arrested for minor offenses, low-level drug offenses, possession of marijuana, and you plead to possession with intent to sell so you don't get popped for possession with intent to sell near a school, right? You get overcharged and over-sentenced so that for-profit prisons can still profit from you. They can't profit from your labor, so they'll profit from your incarceration by overcharging the government for your substandard care. And for-profit prisons lobby the government for mandatory minimums, even collude with specific judges to get more guilty verdicts, longer sentences, mandatory minimums. They can't make the money paying you minimum wage to sell their product or service. They'll make it charging the government for your incarceration. What does that have to do with diagnosis? Well, if function largely means participation in the economy, then if you can't work because you're mentally ill, we'll incarcerate you in a psychiatric hospital and reduce almost all of care to prescriptions for drugs, which are cheaply and easily manufactured. Read, for example, I don't have this book in front of me, Anatomy of an Epidemic. I do have this one. It would be prettier with the dust cover, I guess. This is Drugging Our Children. It's Brent Dean Robbins and Schwarna Elfman. Grab that. 2012, I think that is. It'll make you sick. Elders in senior care are especially vulnerable to over-medication because there's nobody to oversee and object. Children are prone to overmedication because we're busy, and work life demands good grades so you can get into college. And so there's all this pressure to start learning harder topics earlier, and be able to sit in a chair and pay attention to that and not disrupt anybody else. And parents don't have time and whatever. So Anatomy of an Epidemic really is going to get into that. At the psychiatric hospital, when I worked there, I spent 4 years working there. The vendors visited constantly, and they had sandwiches and chips and stuff for the everyday workers not making the decisions, so we'd have more sympathy for them. And they'd have swag, and they'd have hard propaganda. How they buy out the medical journals is another long story for another day. Doctors' offices get these visits. Drug reps have standing appointments to influence doctors. Do I have a TED or something for this? Drugging our children again. There's a chapter in here, a former drug rep, and the tactics that they use to get doctors to prescribe more meds, and specifically their med, for things you could maybe resolve or get help with in psychotherapy. Doctors in medical school get something like 400 contacts, touches from psychopharm reps while they're in med school, buying them lunch, providing notebooks and pens and everything else you need to go to school, and swag and dinners out at expensive places and baseball tickets. And your first diagnosis of a psychiatric condition like depression or bipolar is probably not from a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a psychotherapist who should be trained in all of this, and honestly probably isn't, but has a better chance of this kind of training. It's from an MD, probably in an urgent care or sometimes a family practice, secondary to some other problem. You've twisted an ankle or something and show up at the urgent care, and the nurse, while you're waiting to see the doctor, because we're doing suicide prevention, another topic for another day, just like hands you the Beck Depression inventory, and then you take that and they plug it in the computer and you get this. You don't get the score. The doctor gets the score. They see your weight and your blood pressure and your Beck Depression inventory score, and sometimes whether you feel safe at home. And they're treating you for your sprained ankle. You're in pain, which absolutely changes your score on the Beck Depression. You're having a bad day, and you pop one over the threshold on this thing, and they diagnose you on the spot with depression. They go back to the samples cabinet, which is overflowing with samples of the newest thing from the psychopharm reps, and in good faith, because they want to reduce your suffering, and they're invested in this medical model of mental illness. They give you a free sample, like the crack dealer on the corner, give you one hit to get on the product. And then, probably your discharge instructions contain, make an appointment with a psychotherapist. You never do. You take the drugs and you feel better because you're not having the worst day of your life. See? Diagnosis at best provides a common framework among professionals. I call your MD or your psychiatrist, they say bipolar. I know what that means. They know what that means. Doesn't mean neurotransmitters. It doesn't mean your mommy was mean to you when you were 5. It doesn't mean some conditioned response. It means a collection of observable behaviors we can group under this heading to understand and potentially treat them. Referring to bipolar as an illness reifies it. Reification means treating abstractions or concepts as though they were real things in the universe. The more something's defined, the less it exists. See one of my other videos on this topic about I probably called it There Are No Triangles. It's really important and really difficult. Look, there's no such thing as mental illness. Even schizophrenia is not a mental illness. It's a biological condition, a poorly understood biological condition with cognitive and behavioral consequences. Because thoughts can't be sick. Brains can, thoughts can't. And depression is less than 3% heritable. The rest, the other 97% plus, is circumstantial because life sucks. A possible harm of throwing diagnoses around loosely is people get drugs and nothing else, or people get a label and little else. Believing that depression is an illness that can be recovered from discounts the circumstances, disempowering people who might be able to change their circumstances, or making less likely the kinds of collective action we would need for whole social conditions such as racism, sexism, transphobia, poverty, homelessness. At worst, this can be gaslighting. Maybe my new client is a Black woman in a racist, sexist society with real problems. How could she not be anxious and unhappy in America in 2022? I'm not worried about the people who are anxious. I'm worried about the people who are not anxious. If I label her with an illness, what I'm saying is your problems aren't real problems. There's something wrong with you, that you're anxious or unhappy. There's something wrong with you that you feel unsafe. Your circumstances aren't objectively unsafe. You're sick. You're unhappy, but you should be able to, work minimum wage at some fast food place, or less than that, driving Uber when you factor in the cost of the car that you're driving and the maintenance thereof. You should be happy doing menial work in the late stages of a crumbling democracy. Don't worry about it. Take your drugs. That's gaslighting. That's absolutely gaslighting. So, Virginia Woolf. To diagnose Virginia Woolf with a bipolar disorder using the current DSM-5 text revision, you have to meet her. Not just one clinical interview, but really 10 sessions is best practice. I'd have to find out the conditions of her life and whether her apparent mood swings correlate to circumstances and to what degree, and what's normal in her society. I'd have to factor in a cultural context. I'd have to be culturally competent about white ladies in 1935, you know what I mean? Then I'd have to carefully contemplate whether a diagnosis would do more good than harm. Ooh, diagnostic harm. There's another video. There's a longer talk in my series on existential psychology I did for a Chinese audience. So there's that. Saying she had bipolar disorder without doing this frankly impossible work, she's dead, is, at best, I can see the good intention, right, of destigmatizing for people who live with what we're calling that now. That's good work. But at worst, it's gaslighting and soft propaganda, which should be considered carefully and in context and not tossed about casually as if it were were a literal truth. And so that's my 2 cents. It's a 50-minute video. That's more than my 2 cents. And thanks for tuning into the Black Pill. I don't know why you do. And catch you in the next video.